Now it's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Tension is mounting along the eastern edge of Ukraine as the build-up of some 100,000 Russian troops along the border has heightened concern that Moscow is preparing for war. The G7 this week warned the Kremlin that it will face massive consequences should it attack Ukraine. So is President Putin getting ready to strike, and can Western governments stop him? We discussed this developing story with Gerard Toal, Professor of Government and International Affairs at Virginia Tech National Capital Region, and Professor Christopher Hartwell, Professor of International Business Policy at Zurich School of Management and Law in Zurich and Professor of Management at Kosminski University in Poland. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us today. And well, let's start with you, Professor Toal. Now, how likely do you think it is that Russia is actually preparing for war to invade Ukraine?
Well, the main indicators are all very concerning. First of all, the military capacity, and you have to look at what a power is going to do, so the military posture. And Russia is clearly going to considerable effort to mobilize the military capacity it needs for a large invasion of Ukrainian territory. Now, this doesn't necessarily point to war. Military buildups can be part of coercive diplomacy, but it's obviously very concerning. Secondly, the rhetoric. Now, the rhetoric has become extreme. President Putin has articulated positions that are frankly imperialistic. That Ukraine is an artificial state, that the Russian and Ukrainian people are one, that Ukraine only prospers when it is part of Russia. And Putin appears to believe he has an historic mission to bring Ukraine back into the Russian world, and that's deeply concerning. And thirdly, the aims. The Russian leadership has drawn some very public red lines in the crisis, demanding legal guarantees that Russia rule out NATO's further that legal guarantees ruling out NATO's further advancement in the east and the deployment of weapon systems on Russia's western borders. And it will be very tough to reconcile those particular demands with stated NATO policy and Ukrainian sovereignty. And then finally, lastly, self-interest. And this is a really interesting one, because posing as a strongman and threatening to invade Ukraine certainly strengthens Putin's position at home and on the international stage. However, actually launching an invasion may well undermine his power. War is a very risky gambit for President Putin at home, within Ukraine, in Europe, in global affairs broadly. Now, President Putin, one thing we know about him, he's got a strong instinct for self-preservation. But it's also evident that he's attracted to geopolitical gamesmanship. And so, again, this is very, very concerning. War is not inevitable here. There are available off-ramps for the parties if they negotiate and if they choose to take them.
And Professor Toal, well, you mentioned rhetoric, and well, Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Ryabkov, he said that Russia and the US might be hurtling towards a repeat of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, how should we interpret this kind of comment?
Yeah, well, yes, I heard that. This underscores how serious the crisis is. You know, the way, in the sort of hyperbolic nature of the kind of frames that are being used around the crisis. And Rybakov's analogy is one example of this. He's framing the issue as a great power conflict, one where Ukraine's agency drops out and the conflict is between the United States and Russia. Now, comparing it to a major crisis during the Cold War, a high stakes standoff that nearly tripped into a nuclear war, well, that's a Russian official seeking attention for the crisis, ringing alarm bells, so to speak. But he's also promoting Russia's understanding, self-understanding of it as a great power encroachment crisis, one where a faraway external power is trying to construct military infrastructure close to the homeland of an enemy state. So that frame is one that sort of promotes a Russian way of looking.
And Professor Hartwell, well, while there's generally alarm surrounding the rapid militarization along the border, some see the build-up as Putin's way of getting the West's attention, as dealing with the Kremlin isn't exactly high up on Mr. Biden's agenda right now. Do you also see this as a language of diplomacy?
Well, he's not exactly trying to get everyone's attention. I think he's trying to strike at a moment of weakness, which is what happened in Ukraine in 2014 and 2015. The seizure of Crimea was entirely just opportunistic, as was kind of the movement into Donbass. I think right now Putin senses that things are weak in the United States, especially in the presidential administration. The Obama administration did nothing to stop Putin the first time around in Ukraine, and Biden is coming from that same administration. So I think there's definitely a sense that that's the issue. I also think you've mentioned already domestic kind of factors helping to propel Putin forward. We're looking at an egregious mishandling of COVID-19 within Russia. We have official death statistics of about 280,000 people, but we have independent analysts who say that excess mortality is actually closer to 900,000. So that's a discrepancy of about 700,000 deaths. I think the average Russian in the street knows that the government has mishandled this. Putin is becoming more unpopular, and when Putin becomes unpopular, he becomes much more dangerous. We saw this with Chechnya in 2000, we saw it with Georgia in 2008, and we saw it with Crimea in 2014. So I think all of these things are coming into play. It's not necessarily that he's saber-rattling to get some attention. He's using it to deflect attention from some of his domestic failings.
And well, as long as the tensions there continue to mount, Professor Hartwell, Mr. Biden, he's been speaking with leaders of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy. The G7 ministers have been talking. They've been coordinating on the messaging and the potential sanctions that they might place on the Kremlin. And of course, the Nord Stream 2, that's at the heart of all this talk about sanctions. And while it's not an ideal situation for Germany, how do you see the new German government working with the Biden administration on this?
Well, I think Professor Toal hit the nail on the head when he said it takes away the Ukrainians' agency. This is what we keep hearing. We keep hearing, oh, what is the U.S. and Germany going to do? I mean, the U.S. has already said that it's not going to sanction on Nord Stream 2. Or maybe we'll sanction later, but we're not going to do it right now. The German government now might turn a corner from what Angela Merkel's policy was, her Ostpolitik, which was very 1970s West German. But I don't think we're going to see a repudiation of Nord Stream 2. The German economy runs on Russian gas. It is fine to throw Ukraine under the bus if this is what it takes to secure energy supplies for Germany. So in that sense, I think you have the Biden administration, which wishes that this Russia thing would just go away because it has transformative things to do in the United States. You have a German administration which is going to be very interested in securing German energy security. And Ukraine is just a problem in this, a problem to be solved. We've already had the Biden administration and the German foreign ministry kind of pressuring Ukraine to accept kind of terms of deals, accept things to kind of keep the peace, as it were, even though it's not Ukraine that is disturbing the peace, it is Russia.
And Professor Toal, well, with the United States having turned its main focus to the Indo-Pacific region, how do you think Mr. Biden's response is going to be?
Well, yes, Professor Hartwell is absolutely correct. President Biden really has his hands full right now. He's trying to get a major piece of legislation through Congress to deal with a resurgent pandemic, spiking inflation, a radicalized Supreme Court, a subversion of democracy, the effects of climate change, and all in the United States. And so, but having said that, managing Russian and European security is always going to be at the top of the agenda of any U.S. president. And the U.S.-Russia relationship has been the center of world affairs for about 80 years. Russia has the nuclear capacity to destroy the United States in a matter of minutes, and every U.S. president knows this. The U.S. may want to pivot to strategic priority areas other than Europe, but events keep pulling them back. And Biden, I think, has played the crisis well, and here I would disagree with Professor Hartwell. He's put diplomacy first. He's consulted with allies. He's restated principles. He signaled tough sanctions that are ready, like Nord Stream 2. But he's also made it a priority to talk with Putin. He has not responded to continued threats from Moscow with escalatory rhetoric of his own. He's not engaged in any insulting rhetoric or felt the need for sort of macho gunfighter talk. He's an experienced statesman. He's elderly. He's overworked, to be sure, trying to manage a very, very difficult relationship.
Well, Professor Hartwell, the Minsk agreements in 2014 and 2015, they aim to end fighting in areas of Ukraine, but their effectiveness seems to have fizzled out. Do you see the two sides working towards a renewal or a similar form of diplomatic agreement?
Well, the Minsk agreements didn't work because there were still, quote unquote, humanitarian convoys, which were coming from Russia, which contained ammunition, men's material that were pouring into East Ukraine. You know, the little green men are still there, and everyone knows that they are Russian regular forces, that that any kind of quote unquote pro-Russian or separatist movement that there is in Donetsk and Luhansk is being led by Russian regular commanding officers. So the only reason that the Minsk agreement hasn't worked is because one of the parties to the agreement continues to meddle in the internal affairs of another country, which is, of course, Ukraine. We've seen Putin utilize this tactic of creating frozen conflicts elsewhere to kind of get his way. First off, to manipulate utilizing global proxies. You see it in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria especially. And it could be that he's trying to expand it now to make sure that Ukraine is never admitted into NATO or even the European Union, because a country that has this kind of frozen conflict and these territorial claims is just not suitable. And so that could be what's happening here. But realistically, I think the Minsk agreements were dead on arrival, and there is no reviving of them now.
And Professor Hartwell, it's really hard to see Mr. Biden or Mr. Putin backing down from the Ukraine crisis, yet neither of them would want the situation to escalate. Do you see any possibilities of them making concessions? I mean, how do you think they're going to be able to manage their differences over this?
Well, Putin has painted himself into a corner. You know, he's the machismo, the posturing, as Professor Toal said. And I think it's going to be very difficult for him to come out of this. Although one of the benefits of being an authoritarian leader means that you get to control the state propaganda apparatus. And as easily as you ratchet up the rhetoric, you can tone down the rhetoric and act like, yes, A is B and B is A. And it's always been that way. So I think that's something that can definitely be kind of, that's at Putin's control. But it's going to be more difficult for him to get out of this without extracting some concessions. And I think Biden is exactly the person who he wants in the White House, who will give him some concessions. Again, we've seen this before, the kind of pressuring the Ukrainians to make this go away. I don't want to use the term appeasement, but basically to, even if he is overworked, even if he is overwhelmed, Professor Toal was entirely correct in saying that kind of the Russian-U.S. relationship has been the cornerstone of kind of global politics for 80 years. And this is something that he should take a bit more seriously. And I fear that given Biden's own personal experience in the region, this is just going to be another problem to manage, another problem to communicate more effectively to the American people, rather than seeing it as an intractable problem that has much, much longer ramifications, especially if there is anything in the way of appeasement.
And Professor Toal, now, earlier this year, Biden and Putin, they were aiming to reset the tone of bilateral relations. How far do you think they can actually go on this? I mean, what are some areas that they could perhaps see some progress in?
Well, obviously, this crisis doesn't help in resetting the tone of U.S.-Russian bilateral relations. It's a dangerous moment, and I certainly hope that negotiations forced by this crisis can be the basis for building back better diplomatic capacity in U.S.-Russian relations. There are a lot of very serious issues to address, as Professor Hartwell mentioned. The Ukrainian one is an intractable one. It is to be managed, and it does require compromises on all sides. There is room for a compromise on deconflictualization of particular military exercises, jets, going past each other, ships in the Black Sea and elsewhere. We also have arms control. Arms control is at the very, very top of the agenda of U.S.-Russian relations. Thankfully, we have a New START renewed, but we have no INF treaty. That's the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which the Trump administration pulled out of in August 2019. So we've no arms control regime in this domain, and I think the uncertainty surrounding that is playing into this crisis. Now, climate change is another common security issue where they can and they should deepen cooperation. And let me say, collectively, we face this enormous crisis. And it is one that will alter the planetary conditions that has given us life, that has allowed human civilization to thrive for so long. That issue, which is absolutely fundamental, it struggles to get to the top of the agenda because of all of these other geopolitical brinksmanship and geopolitical games of various types. And I think that is something that we're going to see down the next number of years. There's going to be geopolitical crisis on the front of our newspapers, and there's going to be a climate crisis, extreme weather. They're going to be right together, as we see already in our newspapers.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up the discussion here today. That was Gerard Toal, Professor of Public and International Affairs, and Christopher Hartwell, Professor of International Business Policy, joining us from Virginia and Zurich. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.